Fakhruddin sir, sir, please unmute and
Hello.
yeah, sir. Sir, welcome, sir. Friends, now we have speaker, Dr. B. Fakhruddin. Fakhruddin sir is a professor at university and HOD, Department of Biotechnology and Crop Improvement, College of Horticulture, University of Horticulture Sciences, Bagalkot. Dr. Fakhruddin sir is a specialist in marker assisted breeding as well as the development of transgenic plants. During his curricula, he developed so many transgenic lines of pigeon pea, as well as he is one of the leading scientists in the development of BT Brinjal program. Also, he has developed many marker assisted breeding lines in his career. So without giving much introduction about Dr. Fakhruddin sir, I would like to Dr. Fakhruddin sir and hope you all will enjoy his speak. Dr. Fakhruddin sir, please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abhijit. Namaste to everyone. Good morning. It's pleasure to come and talk to everybody. I see many seniors on board, and I also heard Dr. Hemant Patil sir and all committed seniors. Thank you for your good words, and it's pleasure to be for 1 hour with everyone to share our experiences. And I particularly have designed the talk in such a way that it is really very basic, because Dr. Abhijit told me that many students are there, and then a few applied aspects of the same. So that's how I have planned. Should any students have any questions, you can ask me, and I'll try to answer them. Thank you once again, Dr. Abhijit and organizers for giving this opportunity.
Welcome, sir.
I'll now start. Maybe I need to share.
Yes, sir. Please share your slide.
Please make him co-host.
Yeah, co-host.
Abhijit, I don't see share.
Yeah, just a moment, sir. Sir, I'll make you co-host. Sir, now you can share, sir. Now you are co-host, so you can share.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes.
You see?
Yes, sir. Sir, please go ahead, sir. We can see. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So the topic is DNA markers in crop improvement, crop breeding, basics to applications. As start my video. Okay, Dr. Abhijit, can you see this slide, the screen?
Yes, sir. Sir, we can see, sir. Yes, sir.
I'll start.
Yes, sir.
DNA markers in crop breeding, basics to applications. As I mentioned to you already, this is basically a very basic talk, followed by how to use these markers in actual crop breeding. I have taken a couple of examples in different domains of applications. Mostly what we have done over a period of 20 years or so with the help of my students and the funding mostly from DBT, ICR, and state governments. I hope it will be useful. DNA markers, to start with, let us look, what are these markers? If you try to define the markers, markers can be defined as an allelic difference or a variation at a given locus in the genome. It's a difference or variation at a given locus, a specific locus in the genome, that can be observed at 3 levels. One is morphology, another is biochemical level, and then DNA level. So these are the 3 levels at which any locus, a variation in a locus, can be observed. And these variations serve as references for us to do breeding, to characterize the germplasm, to handle it basically. Now, at morphological level, obviously locus to express, it has to manifest phenotypically, then only you will be able to see. Because of the, and that is one side. On the other side, our ability to see that difference is yet another important aspect. The manifestation is there, but my eyes cannot see it, then it is not polymorphic to me. Maybe I need to use another technique, like maybe microscope, to see that difference. My naked eyes can't see it, I need to amplify it and see it. So that's how morphological variations have to be accounted for as markers. So obviously, the number of morphological variations that one can account as markers will be limited. You can actually count, keep counting, and only 50, 60, 70 maybe. Beyond that, we can't go. If you want to go beyond that, you need to use another technique, maybe like a microscope or whatever it is. But at biochemical level, these variations, they in fact manifest as isozymes. There are plenty in number, and we can use them also just like morphological. But as it is biochemical, obviously it is a protein, and therefore it is G into E. It has to interact with the environment, and then gene has to express. So because there is an interaction there, the expression levels, the quantitative and qualitative expression of these biochemical markers obviously will vary. To that extent, we will have a limitation in terms of their realization as markers. Then the another level at which you can see these markers is DNA. Obviously, DNA is a very stable, it's a huge molecule. There are thousands of positions where you can find these variations. At every loci, you can find the variation, and it is plenty. And definitely there won't be influence of environment onto the variation that we see in the variations or differences in the alleles on DNA at DNA level. So therefore, they are plenty in number. But only thing is, you can't see them by phenotype. Obviously, you need to have some sophisticated technique by which the variation that we observe at DNA is realized. Definitely, we can't deal with them like you deal with morphology. You need some sort of sophisticated technique, like either blotting techniques or like DNA, PCR technique, things like that. Some sort of technique has to be used, and in order to see the variation that we see at DNA level. And this is plenty, obviously. Why plenty? Because there's such a big genome in every organism, and multiple points there are variations that we can realize. Then what is this variation? What is this polymorphism? Something that we often use the word polymorphism with markers. This is a condition where gene or a locus have one or more alleles or variations. At that particular position, there are variations. If it is a gene, there is a variation in the loci that we talk about, and it's a marker. Again, at that particular loci, there is a variation. That variation we need to elucidate and then use it for our purposes. Then what are these types of markers? Typically, when we start reading in any textbook, we see morphological markers, as we discussed already, and then molecular markers, which are divided into biochemical markers, such as proteins, metabolites, secondary metabolites, etc. And then nucleic acid based, as we discussed already, DNA or RNA based molecular markers. So typically, DNA markers, they can be classified in a variety of ways. Number one, based on their mode of transmission. Okay, based on mode of transmission, and then mode of gene action. These are the two ways in which also they can be classified. Mode of transmission, they could be biparental nuclear inheritance type of marker. It could be a maternal nuclear inheritance type, or it could be a maternal organelle inheritance type, or it could be a paternal organelle inheritance type. All these types of possibilities are there for the transmission of a molecular DNA marker. Then the other type that we can visualize is based on gene action, that is dominant or codominant type. Okay, these are the two ways in which we can classify these DNA markers based on their transmission type and then expression type. The mode of gene action, if you look in this particular gel picture here, you have P1 and P2. In P1 it is present, in P2 it is absent, and in F1 it is there. That's a typical dominant nature. In a codominant nature, you see that in P1 it is there, in P2 it is polymorphic, it is there at a different level, And then in F1, because it is co-dominant, both are dominant, both of them will appear in F1. So this is what is a typical co-dominant nature. This is the typical dominant nature that you observe in these DNA markers, just like we see in genes, dominant gene, co-dominant options. So similar to that. Now, another way is method of analysis. How do I analyze these markers? How do we realize these markers, or how do you detect these markers? One is hybridization based methodology, or another is PCR based methodology. PCR based methodology is more prevalent. Hybridization methodology was there some time ago in the beginning, but made a big contribution because of the robust nature and very handy nature. PCR based markers are very popular, and that's what we use. So method of assay, as we saw, hybridization or PCR based, you have either like arbitrary primer involving PCR based method like RAPD and AFLP kind, or you have sequence based like SSRs or SNPs and other types of markers. Hybridization, typically RFLP. Now these molecular markers, if you look little into their characteristics, as we saw, they are codominant, like at least SSRs are codominant, SNPs are codominant, they are codominant. That means you have more information, you are not losing any information from both parents, you realize it. Then they are non-destructive in nature, in the sense when you want to measure this marker, these molecular markers, you need not have to destroy the plant. You can just need to take a little bit of leaf or any tissue and then try to do assays of thousands of markers that you want. So it's non-destructive in nature. Then complete penetrance. This is something that is very good with these markers. There is nothing like, unless you see in case of morphological markers and biochemical markers, where incomplete penetrance is there often because they interact with the environment, and depending on environment, their expression changes. Here, penetrance is complete. What is penetrance? Ability of a gene to express itself, is it not, in quantitative genetic? Here, penetrance is complete for a marker. It is there. If it is there, it is there. So that's the way. That is the beauty, yet another beauty. Then the early onset of phenotypic expression. That means as soon as when it is small seedling, you can in fact assay. You can assay the markers right at seedling stage or even at seed stage. Then they are highly polymorphic. There are a large number of them, and they are highly polymorphic as well. Then random distribution throughout the genome. This is another beautiful aspect about this beautiful characteristic of these molecular markers. They are randomly distributed for all practical purposes. They are randomly distributed throughout the genome, and therefore it's possible for us now to model, apply certain models onto it in order to use them in our genetics and breeding kind of endeavors. Assay can be automated. This is another thing that has helped a lot. We can automate the assay of the presence or absence of it can be automated, and that has in fact helped their utility in breeding endeavor. Then methodologically, there are certain advantages with these molecular markers, such as DNA isolated from any tissue can be used, leaf, root, any part of the tissue you can take, of the plant you can take, and it's going to be the same. It's not that if you take tissue from the leaf, it is going to be different, and if you take from root, it's going to be different. No, any part of the tissue at any stage, you can take the tissue and then do the assay. Therefore, in the earlier slide, we saw early onset. That's what it is. Then DNA has long shelf life, ready to exchange between labs. You can, typically you see in the industry, the mapping populations are grown in one country, the samples are isolated and sent to some other country for the DNA marker assay, and then the data will come in the computers or in the internet, and an analysis will happen in some other place. So that's another big advantage of this type of methodological advantage that is there with molecular markers. Then the analysis of DNA carried out at early age, even at the embryonic seedling stage, is a possibility. That's at another method, as we discussed it already. The stage, irrespective of male, female, plant, disease, drought affected, or whatever it is, you still can do. You can use the tissue for the purpose. If you look at the theoretical limitations, genetic complexity of the trait to be improved is one theoretical limitation that one has to really consider. What is the character that I am targeting to improve using markers? Are DNA markers really helpful in order to improve this character? Is something that we need to consider. It's not that for everything markers are the answer. Definitely no. There are theoretical limitations. Like any other technology will have a limitation. Markers also would have limitations. Those are the theoretical limitations that we need to consider. What is the genetic complexity of the character that we are considering? Depending on that, how many markers I should use, what type of marker I should use. These are the things that we need to consider. Then the accuracy of phenotypic evaluation is very important. Marker by itself would be there and will be there. But when you want to link that the markers with the phenotypic trait, then the phenotyping per se must be very accurate as possible, required statistical designs, then the accuracy, the field plot techniques, utility of the latest gadgets in the process of phenotyping, and eventually achieve that precision. That is very important. In fact, without proper phenotypic evaluation, marker data goes underutilized, in fact. Then the evaluation of G into E interaction is very important, especially for the phenotype, because phenotype is the product of a G into E. Given that, the interaction component has to be accounted properly, take out the errors, and then use the values. Evaluation of epistatic interactions is yet another thing when we have to keep it in mind, and accordingly use the markers. So that's another theoretical limitation we have. We will have to consider it very seriously when we try to apply the markers. So with all these theoretical limitations in mind and the potentialities of the markers, the practical limitations that one can look at if one tries to look at the markers is DNA markers is the number of samples that can be analyzed is something that if you have like now, of course, it's you can handle thousands of samples in an automated scenario. So the number of samples, it's not like we have 10,000, 20,000. Does it warrant to use so much? What is the sampling strategy that we need to adapt over there? These are the kind of things that we need to have in order to overcome the limitation. But if you are trying to if you want to allele mine a particular loci, then there is no way you need to do it. But there are also circumstances where you can be smarter and try to use optimal number of samples to do this. The belief that relationship changes with additional germplasm, there is another limitation. Suppose you have a set of germplasm, you have characterized that germplasm using DNA markers. Now you are going to add additional few lines into that. What is going to happen to the entire structure of that germplasm? We should have a clear understanding of that. And in fact, it changes. The number of genotypes that can be improved within a given time using is another practical limitation. In fact, many of these limitations can be overcome or have been chased with the improvement in the tools and techniques that are around this. So with this, briefly, some of these DNA markers we shall look into before getting into applications. One of the first DNA marker types that was discovered and used, and which also made a big dent in the science of application of DNA markers, is restriction fragment length polymorphism, quite long ago in 1975. So this is basically the polymorphism with respect to a restriction site of a restriction enzyme, just like EcoR1 recognizes this particular site, and this restricts at this position. So if this position varies between two chromosomes, homologous chromosomes, then you have the differences there. Then if this position varies between two accessions or between two varieties, then you have the polymorphism realized over there. So this has to be therefore done using this restriction enzyme EcoR1. Like that, every enzyme will have restriction site, and in every enzyme at every possible position in the germplasm there will be a variation. We need to use these restriction enzyme, cut it, and realize the difference. That is restriction fragment length polymorphism, as As all of us know, it involves digestion of DNA with restriction enzyme, then taking this DNA onto a nylon membrane, and then we need to blot using a probe. Then the probe obviously is the radio labeled probe, and then you need to detect that on a membrane. And once you detect on the membrane, whether at that particular position the enzyme has cut or not is realized in a way that the differences in the size of the fragments will be there on the X-ray film. So this particular process is essential in order to realize this. There are improvements, there are automations, in fact, if not the entire process, in parts of this process. But the biggest concern is we need to use the probe, and which is radio labeled probe, basically radioactivity we have to use, and that has been the concern. So sooner or later, when a better technique or a technique with without radioactive material was available, these kind of methods, this method particularly took a backseat. But otherwise, in the beginning, this made its contribution, especially in DNA fingerprinting kind of endeavor. Then if you chronologically go, then came a PCR based method called randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, wherein it is a PCR based method where 10 to 12 base pair, a primer is used. A random amplification of several such fragments will happen all over the genome, and those amplified fragments are they are detected using ethidium bromide on the gels. They are run on the gels and they are detected using ethidium bromide. With all that, it is far more easier compared to that of the RFLP. You have large number of markers detected on the gel, typically using ethidium bromide, and the whole process would take about 2 to 3 hours. And this worked for some time, for a few years, from 1991, from that time. But unfortunately, unstable amplification led to the poor repeatability. That's been a big concern. This is the basic paper, Williams 1990 development to RAPD paper, which came in the PNAS. Then if you look at this RAPD, typically this is PCR based method, as we saw. The difference between PCR and RAPD is you use template DNA, everything is same, and you use one short primer in case of RAPD. But in a typical PCR, you use 2 primers, forward and reverse primer. But in case of RAPD, you use only 1 primer, which acts as both forward and reverse. And therefore, same primer has to act forward and reverse, and it will have its own dynamics to that extent. Now, genomic DNA normally is complementary at several locations for this random primer, which happens through PCR. Let us look into this PCR technique. Typically, a PCR, you have the double-stranded DNA just like this. When you heat it to 94 degree, DNA will denature like this. Once it is 94, when you reduce the temperature to like 35, 40, or 50, when you reduce the temperature, annealing of primers will happen. They try to come together, but they will not come in that short time. But short sequences such as these primers will go and anneal at this temperature, at reduced temperature. And once you raise the temperature to 72 degrees centigrade, where the Taq polymerase functions, the Taq polymerase will extend this primer like this on both sides. So that way, the DNA 2 strands became 4 strands, or 2 copies, additional copy came up there. So again, raise the temperature to 94 degree. Those 2 newly formed copies will again anneal, denature, and then you repeat it for 30 to 40 times. When you repeat it so many times, the copies in exponential manner will happen just like this. You heat, you cool, your annealing will happen, extension will happen, right? And we repeat it multiple times. When we do it, typically like this, the DNA will amplify. So you will have large quantities of DNA at the end of the PCR cycle. So in this endeavor, when you are in a typical RAPD, a single primer would be acting. It would go and bind in both directions possible on both strands, just like this. But there are only few situations that would help it to amplify. For example, here it is in opposite direction. So definitely exponential amplification will not happen. There are also situations where they are like tandemly placed like this, where the amplification, again, the typical amplification will not happen. Or they could be placed very far away. Under those circumstances also, they will not be able to amplify completely. But wherever they are in an optimum, optimum distance is there between these two primers which are oppositely placed, then definitely the amplification will happen to the expected way. And then you will see bands like this. The amplified product, when lithium bromide is used for staining, typically you see like this. In this particular gel, one important component that we need to look is, you see that here bands are, one band is missing. And if you look at this magnesium chloride, when it is 2 milligrams, a band is missing. For example, you know magnesium, what is the utility of magnesium in polymerase enzyme? It acts as a cofactor. When magnesium concentration was lowered, a band itself is missing. So what is important is we need to be very careful with respect to reaction mixture. The molar nature of all components is extremely important. Optimizing conditions is very important when we are trying to use PCR based technique. Now, there are many, as we saw, there are a lot of problems with this particular marker type, especially repeatability. And because of that, it's hardly used now, although even if you use it, it is like converted into SCAR kind of thing. These are all different modifications of that thing. Hardly we use this marker type now. But if you are very careful, and if you have no access to resources, and genome sequence is not available, and you are dealing with a very monogenic gene, and you don't have any other markers, but you have this particular markers plenty in your lab, definitely will be it's possible to identify markers that are linked to single genes. And then once you identify that, you need to, of course, convert into a more robust SCAR kind of marker and use it in the breeding endeavor. But if you have other good markers, then I think it's not wise to use this marker type. Then the other marker type is amplified fragment length polymorphism, or AFLP. This is a very, very good marker type because the plenty of polymorphic markers are available once you use this technique. But only thing is the tediousness of the technique is one concern. Here in AFLP, typically DNA is digested, adapters are ligated to the digested DNA, then amplifications are done using primers that are complementary to adapters, and then certain modification to those the primers is done to reduce the number of copies. Then electrophoresis. Once you electrophorese it, you can do silver staining, or we can use radioactivity as well in order to realize, depending on availability of the functions, facilities. Typically, we use a 4-base cutter and 6-base cutter to start with to digest the DNA, genomic DNA. For example, like a 4-base cutter like this and a 6-base cutter like this, use both and then digest the DNA. Once you digest the DNA, then you have the fragments, array of fragments that are formed, just like this. So to this fragment, we need to ligate a adapter. It's like there are sticky ends on both ends, and comfortably we can ligate it. Once you ligate this, every fragment that is generated because of the restriction digestion now is ligated with the adapter. Now, adapter specific primers can be employed in order to amplify this region using PCR. While the problem is, when you digest the restriction, whole genome with the restriction enzymes, you find millions of fragments, plenty of fragments. When you run it on the gel, you see a typical smear, a smear is seen. So we can't realize all those fragments. So we need to reduce those fragments. That's why we do a PCR here. So how do you do PCR? You design a primer which is complementary to this adapter. While designing, see that you add one base, ATGC, one of the ATGCs at the 3' end, and then do the amplification. Or add two bases like GRC or ART, one of any 2 bases, additional 2 random bases to the primer, and then do the PCR. As and when you add a new base, an extension like this, see, you can see here, an extension like this, number of fragments that are going to amplify will drop down drastically, because at every position, next position to this restriction site here, when you add G, only those fragments which have C over there will only be amplified, not others. So that means only 1/4 of all fragments that are there in the smear or in the digested product are amenable for getting amplified. So the moment you add 2, for example, G and T, then even more it gets reduced. 1/4 into 1/4, that will be the probability. So the moment you add one more, like 3 base extension, then it is 1/4 into 1/4 into 1/4 would be the probability. So this way, the number of fragments that are amplified post restriction digestion is going to reduce heavily as and when we add one restriction base. So for example, one addition of selective base on primer can reduce number of DNA amplified bands 16 folds. If you add 4,000 folds reduction will be there. So that way, by adding 2 to 3 bases additionally, we can really reduce the number of bands that are there. And then do the PCR and run it on the gel, actually will have fewer fragments. And normally 100 to 30 to 100 DNA bands can be easily detected in a typical polyacrylamide gel, and then you score them. So this is the way this polyacrylamide gel can be used. Or if you use the radioactivity, then you can radioactivity can also be sandwiched to the primers, and then you can use as well. But polyacrylamide gels can also be used in a very routine labs. So this is how this is used. This is typically a dominant marker, especially for genetic variation detection. It is really good. The DNA variation is detected by presence or absence, because it's a dominant in nature. So to that extent, it can be it has its limitation, but large number of fragments are there and highly reproducible, highly polymorphic in nature. Therefore, it's typically a good marker. Once you identify any AFLP marker which is useful, like linked to a trait or whatever, then you need to really convert it into some sort of completely PCR based method routine, so that it can be routinely used without going into any restriction digestion. So other marker type that very early we used to use was like inter-simple sequence repeat, or ISSR. So in short, this marker in this type of ISSR, the SSRs, are the repeat units that are there in the genome, they serve as templates to design the primers, or otherwise the repeat units form the primers, or the primers will be complementary to repeat units, and whatever the distance between these two repeat units which are oppositely placed would be the region that gets amplified. And again, you find multiple bands over here, and very early we used to use this kind of markers. Then came marker type, DNA marker type called microsatellites, or simple sequence repeat markers. These markers are also very plenty in number. Okay, so this genetic marker is based on the variation of unique DNA sequences, usually 1 to 16 nucleotides or more, as core element, which are tandemly repeated in the genome. The allele size primarily determined by the repeat number of core element, the core element whatever, that is, whose number determines the size of it. Typically, they are called simple sequence repeats, or STRs in a code. You can see here TG8, that means T and G is repeated 8 times. Or it could be like AAT6, that means AAT is a core unit which is repeated 6 times. So that means AAT 6 times. So just like that, see, if these are the CA8, CA is the core repeat, and 8 times it is repeated on a chromosome in a DNA. This is how it would be, like, you know, you have CA repeated on one strand, obviously complementary on the other strand, and it is, since it is 8 times and it is dinucleotide, 16 bases would be there. This is the scenario on one chromosome. If it is homologous, similar would be the scenario on the other chromosome within one individual, and in yet another individual or in another accession completely, this particular core unit would vary in its repeat length itself. To that extent, it can become polymorphic between two accessions. So in a typical scenario, these microsatellite, for example, we have two chromosomes, homologous chromosomes. You see on one chromosome, the size is is little bigger compared to another homologous chromosome. So that means this is varying between two homologous chromosomes, right? So that's how the variation is detected. Since it is codominant, when you amplify, both of them will get amplified, and you see two bands. One is two amplicons, one is little bigger one, another is little smaller one to this extent. So we basically amplify this region in a offset. So if you want to realize this typically in a textbook manner, I took it from a textbook. So you have the chromosome like this in a small region. If you take it, amplify it, and then try to look at the DNA, see, you see the repeat motif over here. And in order to amplify this motif, you need to have a primer design this end and this end. Primers have to be flanking, and then do a PCR in order to amplify this particular region and see if there is a variation in this length basically between individuals that you are testing. So they are there in, majority of them are there in the non-coding region. They are also there in the coding region. Also they are there. So if you try to look at the types of SSRs, microsatellites, they could be mononucleotide SSRs, like A repeated n number of times, T repeated, G repeated, C repeated n number of times. That is mononucleotide. It could be like dinucleotide, or it could be like tri, tetra, right? Or it could be like compound SSRs, like, you know, AT 4 times, CA 3 times, constitute to form one core unit. In another case, CCG 3 times and AT 4 times constitute to form a core unit, and such a core unit repeated multiple times. You know, all these kind of scenarios are there. Quite complex, the SSR biology, the structural biology, when you look at it, quite complex. All sorts of things that we can imagine are there in this type. All of them, depending on whether or not we can handle them, will serve as marker types for us in crop improvement. Then we also, I mean, typically they are looked at as perfect SSR repeats, like, you know, A 12 times, AT 12 times, CG 17 times. As I mentioned, it also could be imperfect repeat, like, you know, A you have, and in between there is a nucleotide that is come up. Still it is an imperfect SSR motif only. Somehow there is a new nucleotide added over there. So such SSRs are called imperfect SSRs. So how to detect these SSRs? So this is important. See, in a chromosome, in a DNA, SSR is sitting over here. We need to design a primer, one forward primer and reverse primer. Okay, and then use those two primer pair, I mean this primer pair, in doing PCR, so that this region is amplified. That's how practically it is done. So typically you design these forward and reverse primers, keeping SSR at center, and then the size of the product would be typically good enough to amplify by the enzyme in the PCR reaction, and also good enough to detect it on the gel or whatever the format that you want to really employ. So that's how these SSRs are detected. Say for example, in genotype 1, CT is repeated 25 times, but in genotype 2, CT is repeated, this particular microsatellite is repeated 18 times. Because it is repeated 18 times, so obviously it is small, it has moved more on the gel. It is 25 times it is repeated, it's a little bigger compared to that, and it is moved less. So you see the variation detected on the gel. So the variation between genotype 1 and genotype 2 is detected on the gel, just like this. So SSRs, they used to be very high cost of development. Now the genome sequences are available. Using bioinformatic pipelines, we can really design the primer pairs for the SSRs, which is almost like no cost, because sequences are available already in the major databases. So they're no longer very costly. Another thing that we need to see is these SSRs are not limited to heterochromatin region or repeating region. They are also present in the gene region. So in ESTs, previously using ESTs, people used to discover SSR markers, or any transcriptomes that are coming up now, transcriptome libraries that are there in the public databases can be very well prospected in order to identify the repeat motifs in them. which would be called genic SSRs or EST SSRs or genic SSRs, because those SSRs are present in the gene region. Therefore, they are called genic SSRs. You would wonder, like, a gene that codes for the protein has a repeat element like this. Yes, that's what it is. So somehow that repeat element is there in that gene, and the repeat element is part of the gene for all time. So we try to identify such kind of SSR markers and then call them as genic SSR markers. They have their own advantages. Their abundance is relatively little less compared to that of the other other SSR markers. We typically weigh little more on these SSR markers when we try to use them in order to do tagging, gene tag efforts or mapping efforts, particularly QTL mapping. So see, this is how typically it is. You have the SSR motif over here, and there is a primer design upstream, another primer design downstream. So one is, this is a left primer, this is the right primer. And when you use this primer, this will amplify this entire region from here to here. From here to here, the product size would be around 209 bases, good enough to amplify, also good enough to detect on the gel. So like this, in fact, at our lab, we made large number of them, 512, 20 of them, and then use them in mapping efforts. So you also can do, like, use those SSRs, EST SSRs, and try to detect the variation. You can see P1 and P2, there's a small variation that you can, very minute difference that you can detect. And such polymorphisms have to be detected between pairs of parents that you want to use in your breeding program or in mapping effort. And once you use such kind of polymorphic markers, then they have to be genotyped. So this is a typical RIL genotyping of a marker. You can see one allele is over here, another allele is down, and all these are recombinant in bread lines, about 98 of them. I think this gel was by Rajkumar, and this gel typically you see the iron gold party. So you see the variation because it is RIL. You have only two types. There are no heterozygotes here because RILs are already more than F6, F7, F8 generations, and therefore no heterozygotes. So typically you can see it will be segregating into 1:1 ratio. Then the another marker type is like CAPS marker, cleaved amplified polymorphic sequence. So this is typically where a restriction enzyme is used. The amplified product itself is not polymorphic, but in the amplified product, there would be restriction sites, and those restriction sites would be polymorphic between accessions or between genotypes. So this is yet another way. So typically you PCR amplify the product and then restrict digest that using restriction enzymes, run it on the gel and see if there are variations. So such markers are called CAPS markers. So wherever the enzymes which are like typically which are cheap, cost effective, and still detect some variation within the amplified product are typically useful in this endeavor. So they are quite informative. They are codominant in nature. They are highly reproducible type. So there are many examples where this kind of CAP markers are linked to genes of our interest. People have tried to use, develop that and then use them in the crop breeding, like in rice, wheat. There are many examples. Then there is another marker type called sequence characterized amplified region, SCAR marker. So this is typically a AFLP or RAPD marker where you have multiple markers on the background, but you have one specific amplicon that interests you. So that in those scenarios, we convert that specific amplicon into a SCAR, wherein typically we elute that marker, that particular amplicon, clone it into a vector, and then sequence it. Once you sequence that vector and then try to go little up and down that particular sequence, and then try to design PCR primers such that only that amplicon is picked up, not the rest of the amplicons. So that is like in the next, once you design such primers, then it will be like clean gel. You will have no backgrounds there, and typically that particular amplicon will be there. So the size may vary. It could be like codominant or dominant depending on the opportunity that you have when you really sequence it. you would have opportunity, sometimes you will not have opportunity, sometimes it becomes only you can end up in dominant type, or you can also have codominant type of scar. Both possibilities are there. So this is another thing. If it is RAPD or AFLP, typically we end up in doing this type of exercise at the end to make it more useful. Then you also have something called sequence tagged sites. So here detection of variation that are due to insertions or deletions at a particular position. So the insertion would lead to bigger amplicon, where deletion would lead to smaller amplicon. So that particular nature is used in the STE. Yes. Then there is another marker type called DART assay. This is like quite robust assay, gives you dominant type of markers, but plenty of markers it tries to give you. And once you use typically to characterize the germplasm, this is really a good marker type, or you can use it to put it onto the linkage map also. But once you have the marker in hand, maybe we will need to further characterize it in order to make it more amenable for a PCR based assay. So this is yet another assay. Then we have single nucleotide polymorphism type of DNA markers. They're called SNPs or SNPs. This is this particular marker type very popularly we use now. These days, this is used heavily for many reasons, because they're available, they're abundant, and assays can be automated, and you can virtually go around the region and identify and then enrich that particular region, and many advantages are there. So single nucleotide polymorphism, or a SNP, is a most common form of genetic variation that one can realize in the genome, across genomes in a population. Each SNP is a difference in a single nucleotide, that is at ATGC level, of an individual's DNA, like having AAGG instead of ATGG. So that means at this location, A is replaced by T. That's what is SNP, but it is at population. We need to see it at a population level, not in single individual. This individual should have at least 1%, more than 1% frequency. This type of variation should be occurring in the population. So single base pair differences occurring in a population with a frequency greater than 1% qualifies to be a SNP. So SNP are simply most abundant type that one can realize. So as early as RFLP, in fact, was an SNP, if we carefully see, is it not? So SNPs are biallelic, although 4 different nucleotides could be possible. Typically, they are biallelic. So if you try to look at types of SNPs can be categorized into in a number of ways. Most common ways are like where are they located, or what is their function relative to gene. So based on this, because they are abundant, they are large number, classification is really a challenge for SNPs. Now, there are typically intragenic, extragenic. This is the one type of classification. Intragenic are often categorized by function. They are in the coding region, an intron part of the mRNA, outside the mRNA, but still within the gene locus, such as promoter or whatever. So they are called intragenic SNPs. Other type is extragenic SNPs. They may be like simply genomic. Another word that one can use is genomic SNPs, or might be labeled relative to the nearest 5' or 3' of a gene, but it is not part of the gene. So these are the two categories based on where they are located. An extragenic SNP may affect regulatory regions as well. Then SNP functional categories based on their function. It could be coding synonymous, non-synonymous type, like missense, nonsense, frame shift type of SNP, or it could be a coding synonymous type, or it could be intragenic splice site, mRNA UTR region like 3' or 5' UTR, or it could be gene or locus region 5', 3' of a gene, or it could be like nearer to a gene, like so many base pairs from a gene. Totally, you are looking, whatever we are seeing here, we are seeing towards a functionality or a functional element. We are trying to refer to a functional element and then try to name the SNP. So that's functional categorization of SNPs. Now, SNP nomenclature in human genome, it is much more organized. In fact, almost from a decade, more than 1 decade. And they have proposed a nomenclature also, what type of nomenclature one should follow for the SNPs. Like different sources refer SNPs in a different way. Like if you try to, when you're reading the articles, you see a number of ways in which these SNP markers are referred to. Typically you see like A bar C, A is replaced by C, or like T is replaced by G, or T has become G, or something like that, or C is replaced by T. Like, you use this kind of notations, like greater than, C became T. Or another typical way we see is like at 432 position, G has become C. That's how you see in research articles. Or at times you also see like T at 73rd position has become C. So this is how we read SNPs. This is how typically you see SNP nomenclature. So what is this position, 432 or 73 or whatever? It would be with respect to a promoter or a UTR or some domain of a gene. Human genome nomenclature recommendations are like you use C for a coding SNP. Like C dot means it is a coding, it is present in a coding DNA. That means in a coding region, 76th position, A has become T, like that. Or it could be genomic, where you put G dot 476, A has become T. That's how you read it. Or if it is mitochondrial, then you need to put M. Then if it is RNA, from RNA sequence, then you put R dot, and then this is how the nomenclature of SNPs are typically looked at. Then the frequency of these SNPs, they are actually very abundant, as we saw. The frequency of SNPs and the haplotype diversity, heterozygosity between two individuals are within a population are direct measure of genetic diversity. So that's why we can use these SNPs and measure the diversity. And on an average, overall frequencies of SNPs in human genome is approximately, there is one SNP for every 100 to 300 base pairs. And in plants, these SNPs are actually relatively less studied compared to human, but now you can find lives of SNPs most of the crops. Like in soybean, for example, 280 SNPs are found in a 76.3 kb amplicon of 25 diverse genotypes. In maize also, a non-coding SNP for every 31 bases in that particular study. So typically in potato, you can see 277 SNPs were identified between two alleles of an urease gene. So typically if the gene size was 3000 bases, so many SNPs were seen in that. So this is how the SNP frequency, although it varies from crop to crop, but they are very abundant in any given crop. So if you look at all these marker types and then their utilities, we looked at morphological marker, isozymes, RFLP, RAPD, SSRs, ISSRs, AFLP, SCARs, CAPs, STS, SNP markers. Then typically if you try to use them for DNA fingerprinting, varietal identification, genetic diversity, mapping, gene tagging, marker-assisted selection, high resolution mapping, map-based cloning, novel allele detection, seed purity assays, etc., many more, that kind of applications, their relative amenability or utility or suitability of these markers is like this. So you can see here SNPs and STS markers you can use for most of the functions. Typically SSRs can be used almost for everything. You can use SSRs, although you can use RAPDs also, we have the inherent disadvantage there. Although you also can use the AFLP, but you have the technical tediousness there. But you see SSRs are highly amenable for doing most of that. Similarly, STS and SNPs are highly amenable for most of these functions. Most of these applications that we see. Now, maybe in next 20 minutes or so, what I try to do is how we have tried to use these markers, different types of markers for some of these applications, if not all. I'll try to show how we have used that. Before going to that, if you try to look at the application of these molecular markers, one big application of molecular markers is genetic diversity and fingerprinting. Very commonly used by the breeders, because diversity assessment is very important for a breeder before starting his program. He has to understand what is the material that he has in hand, be it a working collection, be it whatever the type of collection that he has, but he needs to assess the genetic diversity. That part of the genetic diversity that is not really affected by the environment, that component he wants to know, so that genuinity of the diversity can be understood properly and the extent of diversity. Once relationships population that we have, it can be applied to anything, genetic diversity and DNA fingerprinting endeavor. Then inheritance and mapping is another big application of these molecular markers, like simply inherited traits tagged to DNA markers. In fact, tightly linked molecular markers can be identified for simply inherited characters, like single gene monogenic characters, or if they are quantitative in nature, like yield or some disease resistance or abiotic stress or some quality parameters or so, we can map the QTLs, and then even dissection of QTL can be done, or it could simple marker selection. Markers can be used in marker assisted selection. It could be like simple trait, like line conversion, fast track breeding, fast track back of multiple regions, like QTL into QTL into another region, or pyramiding of genes is another way. Then trait introgression from exotic germplasm into a variety of your interest can be used. Or selection and manipulation, allele, early selection, all these kind of markers, so many different types of marker assisted selection procedures. In these procedures, these markers can be very well used. In fact, DNA markers are very powerful tools in this type of application, which is readily required in typical plant breeding endeavors. Or marker based gene identification and isolation is another application of DNA markers. Now, may not be all, but into few where we have our own data, I'll try to share with you. So this is one typical type of, one project we have at now, development of certification protocols for planting material of horticulture origin, wherein typically you know that the nurseries of horticulture crops, especially fruit crops, like once you plant the fruit sapling, it takes 4 to 5 years for bearing. Until that time, you will not come to know what is the real genotype. Is it like typically what you wanted to know, or is it there is some admixture, genetic contamination that cannot be known? So by the time he comes to know a farmer, it will be 4 to 5 years, and then you need to go back to 4 to 5 years in order to make a correction. Or you need to compromise over that and then continue. In overcome that, we proposed a project, and then we now will put DNA fingerprints for nurseries to say that, okay, this particular nursery is selling this material, and this material is genuinely what is it intended for? What is that specific variety, whether it is that variety or a different variety? That kind of genetic purification, certification has to be done, and we have tried to work towards it. So what we have tried to do, see, you can see here, we have developed DNA fingerprints for mango varieties. Over list is actually quite big. Mallika, Alfonso, Raspberry, like this, the several mango varieties are there. There are about 50 of them, and typically 20 of them are seen among the farmers' field. Among 20, there are 5 of them which occupy the larger area in the farmers' field. So we tried to fingerprint about 20 of them. So any of these 20 varieties that we list over here, all these 20 varieties we can make out prints there. So what you see that print, the name, and then this some number you see there, that is the base pair size. So that base pair size of that marker is specific to Alfonso, but not to any other thing. So that's a typical fingerprint for that particular variety, Alfonso, Mallika, Raspberry, like that. So once you have this, you can use these fingerprints in order to certify the nursery or certify the planting material for its genetic purity. So similarly in pomegranate, actually pomegranate was quite a challenging. Ganesha, Ruby, Bagua, wonderful, early Bagua. Between Bagua and early Bagua, hardly there is any variation at genetic level. In fact, we had to work quite hard in order to detect the variation between early Bagua and Bagua. So like that, there is another variety, Super Bagua. So if Super Bagua is different from Bagua, then we had to detect that little difference that you see, and that so we have been able to do that and test them. Typically, once we developed these protocols, we went to nurseries like this. You see Gaurav and Sandeep over there. They're trying to collect samples randomly from the samples, collect over a good number of samples, come in the lab, see whether or not there are any mixtures in that. In fact, we could see some differences in some of those collections. Like, for example, sample number 3 and 15 are not Bagua of the pomegranate. Plantations which are 1 year old, 2 year old, we could see up to 10 to 15% variation, a genotype that is not indented. So this is this kind of, we use these markers in this kind of purity assay. Then marker assisted selection, marker assisted backcrossing, we typically, what we try to do is like there are TY genes called as TY1, TY1, TY2, TY3, TY4, TY5. These genes impart resistance to TYLCV, leaf curl disease in tomato. So we try to introgress the genes into recurrent backgrounds, some regionally popular 3 recurrent backgrounds of tomato, which are of a specific segment. We introgressed these genes very effectively. We followed this kind of method wherein you see that resistant parent contributing resistant parent, and then you have 3 recurrent parents. We made a cross and we went up to BC2, F2, and that is good enough. You can identify the recurrent types which are with the highest genome introgression from the recurrent genotypes into those. So that way, at 2.5 years, it was possible to introgress the whole thing and identify the non-segregating or homozygous backcross line. So these is how typically you see the head is a donor, and then EC the donor. So ANAGA, DMT2, PKM1 are the recurrent parents. So when you, in both backgrounds, we could successfully introgress TY2 and TY3 genes into that. And we have the, after introgression, we try to evaluate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then see, you can see disease incidence at TYLCV incidence 20 and 60 days after transplanting was very minimal, in fact, compared to their counterparts, the ANAGA, DMT2, PKM, so typically. So that means very, very effectively the introgression of those 2 genes have happened, and then the product has the resistance. Right now, these products are in the second year of farm did all of this with more. These are those recurrent backgrounds. This is a typical where we have done this work. Then we also try to process and then go typical like F2, F3, F4 kind of selfie. And at every level, the gene TY1 and TY3 are there using PCR assays, and then develop a good number of lines that are carrying the resistance, yet important from the breeding point of view. So PGNP, in PGNP, Fusarium wilt and SMD are 2 important diseases. Wherein like Fusarium, we made a specific cross. For SMD also, we made specific crosses. We typically developed a recombinant inbred line population like SSD. That was like in order to develop the mapping population, share it across other partners, ICRISAT and NRCPB. And then we also, what we tried to see was like there was a opportunity at the F2. You also can grow F3 families. F2 self F3 families. F3 families can be assessed for their reaction to SMD and Fusarium wilt in the field condition. Taking that phenotype, F2 DNA was used to pool and then identify DNA markers tightly linked to them. So that we could, in fact, very successfully do it. So this is one actually ARS Gulbarga. Aggregating F3 families were planted in this. You can see very typically you could see the wilting, and so much so that, say, you can see here on the left-hand panel, the line which is wilting with the typical homozygous type, and you have on the right side the heterozygous in nature, where the gene is segregating, because F2 every plant is different, and therefore F3 every family is different. But family behavior depends on whether it is homozygous dominant, homozygous or heterozygous. So that field assay done, and using this field assay, we did bulk segregant analysis and identified a marker linked to recessive allele actually, and we published it. We also converted that into a SCAR marker and heavily used in the breeding endeavor for this particular disease. Similarly, for sterility mosaic, it is a little bit complex disease because it's segregated into 30, and still we could do the vectors of feed and at ARS Bidar, where this disease is like typical SME sterility symptoms. And once we had that, then we identified markers over here also, tightly linked markers, and then we used those markers in material, some breeding material being handled by the breeder. We tried to assess and tell him, okay, these are the lines that you should really go ahead with because they have resistance to both diseases, individual diseases, and not the other ones. So typically that was done, and very early, in fact, we could have the products in hand. Like, you see the sensitive ones is completely wiped off for the wilt, while the other ones are really standing there. Marker restrict selected products are really standing over there. So all this work was done under ICR AKI initiative with the great help of Dr. N.K. Singh, Dr. Rajiv Varshney. And then also to do QTL mapping for complex traits. This we did both in sorghum and pigeon pea, but in sorghum, this is how we did. We took a character and then we actually borrowed the population in the initial stages about 12 years ago from the ICRISAT, from Dr. Belam Subbareddy and also Dr. N. Sitaram, then Director NRC NRC sorghum. In fact, they helped us a lot in the initial stages to spare the population, to get projects and so much. And we GLA, like stay green leaf area, 30 days after flowering, 45 days after flowering. This is actually stay green at the end of the crop. Characters also we measured, and we did field evaluation at multiple locations, 2 populations, and genic SSR markers like we developed also a library database called Jawar Gene Repeat Database, and we shared it extensively with many sorghum workers also at the time. We genotyped all of them. We also did SNP mapping using SSCP. What you see at the bottom is SSCP gel. I think Dr. Rajkumar did this perfect, quite exhaustive work he had to do. See, you can see the genotyping. You can see some gels are cracking because there are 14% page. When it is 14% page, and then you're doing SSCP, typically this kind of happen. Although these are low budget, you can do, but students learn a lot. But eventually you get the results. So we developed this kind of linkage maps. We put all those markers onto the map, and then the phenotypic data was used, and we did QTL analysis. In fact, we used multiple algorithms, like more than one type of QTL mapping was done, and then try to see what QTLs are common across these methods of detecting QTLs, and what are common across locations and across maps, and then try to select them. So these are the QTLs that were identified, and this in sorghum. These are the QTLs that we targeted: STG1A, STG2, STG3, CID, carbon isotope discrimination 2. These QTLs were like common between populations, between and between locations and across seasons. So therefore we selected these 4 QTLs, and then we tried to introgress them into 3 backgrounds. Like 4 QTLs were targeted, and M35-1 SPB 86 and 570 lines were introgressed into these 3 recurrent genotypes. We did that very typically. You can see here, and all the 3 QTLs, in fact, all the 4 QTLs we could introgress. So at every generation you do BC1F1 and then confirm whether or not your QTL is there. 1 QTL, 2 QTL, all the 4 QTLs are there, and therefore you had to make multiple, a big population has to be handled, like 360, 410, 380. You can see that type of populations. I think I remember Dr. Rajkumar's intensive effort while doing so. So such big number of markers have to be, data has to be handled, and heterozygous nature has to be confirmed. So in fact, you can beautifully confirm the heterozygous nature of the QTL that you are introgressing. So that's the utility, that's the advantage of using these markers. So once you confirm the heterozygous nature, and that specific individual BC1F1 plant carrying all the 3 QTLs, use that QTL, that particular plant, in order to do the BC2F2, I mean BC2F1 again. So again, BC2F1, do the same exercise, and BC3F1, and then the same exercise, and then identify the homozygous ones, and also do the background selection, which really helps. Actually, from BC2 itself, we diverted and we identified plants. Also, we went to BC3. We had 2 different routes, and at BC3 of 2 plants, you can identify the ones which are carrying all the 4 QTLs in homozygous condition. That kind of thing was identified. So once it was done, like you have combinations of QTLs over there, and you can see what is the relative contribution of each one of the QTL onto the phenotype. That kind of exercise could be done. You could see the individuals carrying all the 3 QTLs carry maximum phenotypic effect compared to their individual other combinations, but there are also other individual combinations which are as good as all the 3 combinations. So it was possible to see this kind of effect. Similarly, we tried to map the root volume, root traits in sorghum. We developed a linkage map, identified QTLs, and then introgressed it. So this is how the mapping population was developed. This is how the phenotyping was done. Typically, root phenotyping requires little different and elaborate and more precise way and effort. DBT was kind enough to give us continuously money for this, and we could do this at the time, and identified the most of these functions already. Then very early with charcoal rot or a stalk rot in sorghum, where the stalk rot is really a problem, because when crop is really ready to mature, the stalk rot comes up and then it falls like this. So the grains will become soiled and you lose. So this kind of thing we identified. We Dr. Sitaram helped us. He also spared the population and encouraged us to have the grants for the DBT. And finally, we with that effort, we identified the QTLs. Dr. Ayyangaud Patil, a PhD student, made a sustained effort. So we identified the QTLs, and then 3 QTLs that are called CR QTLs, charcoal rot QTLs, CR1, CR2, CR3. We tested them into 2 different backgrounds, and again, so using these markers, the zygosity assess could be done. Very early generation background selections. Zygous BC3 of 2 per individual plants were identified. Otherwise, it would have taken a lot of time. The markers really aid a lot when you help them, when you use them carefully. See, this is how we identify the homozygous individuals, and we evaluated them in the field typically, and then we found that you can see here in the right panel, But its introgression, when all the three QTLs were introgressed, you see the disease intensity is very very less. Similarly, SPV86 has the disease original, but the introgressed version has very least or negligible disease or no disease in that. So we could introgress successfully data related to that. So these are a few applications of DNA markers for typical crop improvement type that maybe I thought I should share it with you. These are all the students and research fellows. There are many more of them. I have listed most of them. They were very good in bioinformatics, field testing, a lot of endurance in the field, doing genotyping, phenotyping, trying to learn, all that kind of thing. Of course, we got the funding from KBITS, Karnataka government. We also got from RKBY, ICR, AKI, DBT, continuously, actually, multiple times. So we had extensive collaborations with NRCPB, NRCS. At that time, it was called NRCS, and then ICRISAT while doing this work. So, thank you very much. This is what I thought I should share it with you. So, if you have any questions, and can answer.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So shall we open the topic for question and answer session, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Audience, please, if you have any questions, any doubt, please raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask the question to sir. Just few questions we will take from the audience. Please raise your hand and ask the question directly to sir.
Ajit Kumar, Lalit Nimka, Gaurav.
Please unmute yourself and ask the question. So we have some questions. So we selected from the chat box, and we will ask some questions. They asked by students.
Okay.
So one of the student, he's asking, like, did the development of SNP marker system significantly reduce the use of SSR based marker in plant molecular breeding?
Oh yeah, definitely. Use those SNP markers and then use it in the breeding, develop the resistant varieties. Then certainly once you grow such resistant varieties in the field, the use of pesticides can be reduced heavily. That is the primary target. But the point is, we need to keep it in our mind. Whether it is the moment you say pest resistant, that means if it is an insect. If it is an insect resistance, insect, it's a herbivory. So we need to have a resistant genotype. That's very important. So insect resistance is something that we need to very carefully choose the source, right? So therefore, if you have a resistance for whatever the pest, and we can definitely map the QTLs or genomic regions that contribute for its resistance and use them in the breeding program. If you don't have, then the route would be something else, like transgenic or some other route, disruptive route we need to choose. But wherever there is a source of resistance for whichever pest, we can deal with that pest through molecular breeding. I hope I answered the question. Abhijit?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, sir, for that answer. So another question is, can there be a polymorphism in marker due to change in the region of cultivation for some trait?
Oh,
like he's asking for particular varieties, sir. Like he's asking from Karnataka Alfonso and Konkan Alfonso. So there will be any change?
See, the moment you say Alfonso, then my answer would be different, because it's a long duration crop. Once you plant the mango tree, it would grow for 30-40 years. It would stay, and therefore it cannot be compared to annuals kind of thing. The number of generations that it completes per given unit of time is less. So there would be very minimal changes that one can try to expect among the varieties that you grow. I mean, Alfonso that you grow in Nagiri or in Karnataka. But then the quality aspect of Ratnagiri Alfonso or Karnataka Alfonso would be largely because of the environmental conditions that are prevailing over there and here. This is a part, but in a typical annual crop like sorghum, if you continue grow sorghum or any crop, any germplasm which is annual in nature or many generations per year or few years, over a long period, if you cultivate, definitely there are going to be changes, and they are going to be accumulated into the genome. So that theoretically, yes, it is possible to accumulate variations when you continue to grow a typical variety over a long period of time. So because spontaneous rate of mutation at any given loci at the rate of 10⁻⁶ is always there. So more and more generations you grow, so many generations into 10⁻⁻⁶ would be the proportion of variation that could be accrued at that point. So it is bound to be there. For example, in case of Alfonso, 30 years once if you change the crop, then it is less. You need maybe 300 years for a change that you see in an annual crop that happens in 30 years. So that is the kind of thing that one can try to see.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Another question is there, sir.
Please.
Like Dr. Manoj Kumar Sharma, he's asking, how could DNA fingerprinting be useful for protecting the plant varieties?
Oh, this is a good tool. Fingerprinting is a good tool to protect your germplasm, because through fingerprinting you can develop your identity. You can have your identity of that particular germplasm line with you. So even if you mix it with others, or if somebody takes it, you know that you can identify that germplasm line, and therefore what happens is you can protect. Therefore because you can identify your germplasm line with compared to others, and you can use it. It's an important tool. DNA fingerprinting is a important printing is in protecting germplasm. In fact, now when we need to register the germplasm or release it for the public cultivation, or when you want to share it to others, before that, typically it is good to fingerprint and keep the identity with you, or share the germplasm with the identity, so that you know what is yours. Especially at times where intellectual properties are very important and germplasm is a green gold. I hope I answered.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And another question from Shrikant, like he's asking, quantity traits are controlled by several QTLs. So how many QTLs are typically selected for marker assisted selection?
Oh, excellent. Very good question. Typically for a quantitative character, for a polygenic character, you will find more than one QTL, but each QTL will have its own contribution level, like phenotypic governance, like 20%, 30%, 10%, like this. So whichever the QTL whose phenotypic variance, if it accounts for the maximum, the QTL that accounts maximum phenotypic variance, such would be the QTL that I would want to select to introgress this. So 100% of the character may not be possible, but maximum proportion of phenotypic variation can be introgressed. So if you want more, then maybe if there are multiple QTLs, you need to take multiple QTLs and then introgress them. So when you are having more than one QTL, 3-4 QTL, then although procedure is same, but you need to handle greater amount of progenies in order to get all the QTLs in one place. So that way it is right now practiced.
Yeah. Sir, there are plenty of questions, but the time limits, we cannot
sure.
all the questions.
I can mail also. If you share their email IDs and questions, it will be a pleasure to answer them.
With your permission, I can share your email to the group. And
sure.
Participants, if you have a question, you can ask to sir directly through the email. Thank you, sir, for your wonderful speech.
Thank you.
Your speech is very informative. Always the students and you and me, we fear about the markers, but after going through your basic the lecture of molecular marker, now we don't have fear about this marker breeding. And also we learn so many things, and the application of molecular markers in development of development of
products.
Yeah.
Improved lines.
Improved lines. Yes, sir. Breeding lines and improved lines, sir. So now you took it your very valuable times. You shared the valuable times with us. Even you have the university meetings. So thank you, sir. Thank you for joined us and delivered the
you.
very wonderful lecture, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Bye.
sir. Thank you. Bye, sir. Dear participants,